Well, today is the last review for Edutainment Month, and I thought today's last Ancient DOS game, Thinkin Things Collection 2, was going to be a hit out of the park, just like its predecessor was last year. Unfortunately, it's not. Now, this isn't terrible software by any means, but it's definitely not as well constructed as the original, and even does one thing in particular, which, quite frankly, goes against everything I've ever been taught in school, by multiple teachers, so we'll save that mistake for last. But as for the rest of the program, again, it's not that it's bad, it just doesn't reach the same level of quality as the original. Also, once again, Matt sent me a fully boxed copy of this, and as you can see, it comes on 6 floppy disks, has a couple flyers for winning an education savings bond of $10,000, which I kind of have to wonder if anyone actually won that, and a surprisingly thick manual, which, much to my surprise, it's virtually nothing but descriptions of what every single button and potential interaction does. Very little flavor text in here. Although mostly the same, there are some curious differences in these game stats compared to the original Thinkin Things Collection 1, as Collection 2 was once again made by Edmark and released a couple years later in 1995, but it's actually a 1 to 2 player activity studio program instead of just 1 player. Though I should point out that only one component of this program has 2 player support, and it is primarily 1 player. Also, for the blocked sections of the program, the graphics have been advanced from a modified VGA 320x240 256 color mode to an SVGA 640x480 256 color mode, and there is no backwards compatibility here. Thus, if you run this program without SVGA hardware, you'll get a warning message indicating that the blocks modules won't function. The audio support is otherwise identical to the original Collection 1. As for its current release state, it's still commercial, and similar to Thinkin Things Collection 1, CD copies can be found dirt cheap from places like eBay, but only contain the Windows and Mac versions of the game. If you want the DOS version, you need to find the floppy disk release, which unfortunately is quite a bit harder to come across, and will probably be significantly more expensive if you do find it. Also remember that there were other Thinkin Things programs which came out later, and are similar to the originals, but they have additional subtitles which you can use to help avoid picking those up in place of the originals which don't have subtitles. Already from the start, we can see there's only 5 activities, whereas the original Thinkin Things collection had 6. Now mind you, in both cases, 2 of them are the blocks portions of the program, though given that the blocks portions are significantly different here from before, we'll be going over them again. But let's start with the games. The first up is Frippletration, which is just a basic memory matching game from hell. Oh, you think I'm kidding, don't you? A 4x4 grid with 16 tiles, 8 pairs to match, memorizing the results and winning should be a breeze, right? Well, the game sometimes throws a 6x6 grid at you with 18 pairs to match, which, it's tricky, but it's not impossible. But then, sometimes you get the sadistic 8x8 grid. 32 pairs, all with really similar objects underneath. Yeah, going as fast as I possibly could, this took a solid 8 minutes, and my brain felt like mush by the end of it. So naturally, it gets even harder when instead of matching things visually, you have to match sound effects. Again, this took me about 8 minutes, but the point I'm trying to make is that if it weren't for the fact that you have unlimited guesses in this matching game, there would be no way to win. It's supposed to be exercising one's ability to remember things, and the 4x4 grid does that perfectly fine. But because everything starts looking and sounding so similar, it actually starts cross-wiring the brain, and you end up remembering the wrong things or wondering why 2 things you picked look exactly the same yet somehow don't match because freaking LCD monitors don't have perfectly consistent color across the entire surface. Yeah, this thing is pure evil, and apparently intended for kids aged 6 to 12 years old. Now, before you all write angry comments at me, yes, I'm aware I'm playing this at the highest difficulty setting, as at lower settings you don't get the large grids and the selections you have to match are made more obvious instead of just being color swaps of identical objects. Which seriously, if you were colorblind, you would not survive this matching game. But I wanted to get an idea of just how hard these games can get, and this one gets difficult enough to challenge any full-grown adult. This is also the only section of this program to have a 2-player mode, which works exactly as you'd expect, with the 2 different players taking turns making matches, being allowed to keep making matches every time they make one. I think my biggest complaint actually isn't so much the difficulty, but the name. This section is called Frippletration, which is already a hard name to say, but it's supposed to invoke the notion that the fripples made for these collections have a big role to play here, when in fact, they really don't. Occasionally you'll be matching fripples together in the cards, but the aspect of the fripples which made them enjoyable in the original collection, being able to see them in all sorts of weird combinations and using logic to decipher which ones met certain criteria, that isn't present here, so the name is actually kind of a misnomer. The next section is Orangabanga's Band. Now this one's both neat and a joke at the same time. Now the neat part of it is that kids can create their own simple drum sequences using up to 3 percussion instruments or other wacky things, or even using voice effects, both pre-recorded or by recording their own, and then play those sequences back or save them to play again later. The joke part is everything else. Firstly, let's consider when this came out, 1995. Mario Paint had already come out 3 years earlier for the Super Nintendo, and had a music system which was substantially more capable than this thing, while still being fairly easy to use. Now, this thing's only easier because it's way simpler with way less features. And the worst, though, is the game you play here. Now, there's 2 modes to this game, Who and Which. Now, regardless of the mode you play, you'll see 2 to 4 patterns at the bottom, and we'll hear the band play, and then in the Who mode, one of the patterns is highlighted, and you have to guess which band member played that pattern, or in the Which mode, one of the band members will ask you to select which pattern they played. The reason this is a joke is simple. There's 0 actual challenge. Now sure, trying to legitimately associate these patterns to the sequences you hear is extraordinarily difficult. In fact, it's too difficult. And since there's no penalty for guessing wrong, and since there's so few possibilities presented, you just have to keep guessing and you're going to get it right very quickly. This entire section is basically teaching kids to avoid challenge and take shortcuts, which is not a lesson you should be teaching children. Next, let's talk about the blocks sections. The original collection had a couple blocks sections as well, but these ones are done differently than before, and I think these new ones are actually pretty interesting by comparison. In one of them, you have an elongated texture being applied to a 3-dimensional lathe object, which will then spin, showing the texture on its surface, and also on the flip side through any parts you color in as transparent. You can use preset lathes or custom create your own lathe very easily, and can adjust things such as how fast it spins and how it moves, which is all done in a similar way to the previous block segments in the prior game, where you click and drag to move the lathe object, and when you release the mouse button, the velocity and direction you are moving the mouse in translates to continual motion. You can also design the background however you want, or select from presets. And speaking of presets, there is a surprisingly large number of pre-built selections to look through, some of which are actually really clever, like the ballerina dancing around, or the fripple bouncing on the trampoline. Whee! The other block section has the user forming a pathway for a sort of snaking object to follow, which can be made up of various simple shapes which stagger in different ways or change size in different ways. And the background can now have a masking layer set in order to determine which parts the snake will show in front of and which ones it will move behind. Again, there's a ton of built-in examples of animations that can be done with this, and some of them are extremely clever, such as this sequence showing a ride down a water slide, or this one showing the VU meters on a radio. But I saved the worst for last, and that's the return of the Toonie Loon. Now, anyone who's used this program before is probably already giving me the evil eye, like, how in the world is this the worst part of the program when it's the most comprehensive of them all? Well, let me explain. Firstly, unlike in the first collection program where this section was mostly just following random notes or making up your own songs to play, the latter of which you can still do in this program, the main attraction this time around is learning real musical compositions. And there's a significant selection of tunes here, 15 in total. Pretty much all of which are songs you'd learn at some point or another in elementary school. Well, maybe in American school, because there's a couple of these I never actually heard before, although I did recognize most of them. Sort of. And one of the first problems with this part of the program is the pacing and the actual notes being played. Now, some of the songs are definitely being played at the wrong tempo, usually slower than you would expect, but worse still is some of them either have notes added which shouldn't be there, or the wrong notes. And I have checked with actual sheet music out there, and some of these songs are definitely not right, which can make trying to play them back very difficult if you already know the proper song, because it creates a conflict between what you want to play versus what the game wants you to play, and you're not really sure which is right. Another more minor issue is that because some of these songs require notes which aren't present on such a small xylophone, some of them have had their pitch shifted up or down an octave to compensate. This makes some of the songs sound a little weird. However, all of that is ultimately minor. The major issue of this part of the program is that the way it teaches these musical compositions goes against everything every music teacher has ever taught me. You never start over. The way you're supposed to learn a new piece of music is to follow along as best as you can, and if you make a mistake, you just pick back up from where that mistake was made, or if you're following along to a song as it's being played, you jump back in as soon as you're able to. This way, you're learning and practicing the whole song, not just pieces of it. If you start over when you make a mistake, then you end up focusing too heavily on the beginning parts of the song, and will be ill-prepared to play the song in its entirety until after way more practice. So, it's not that you can't learn a song this way, but it takes way longer, and you'll never be as well practiced at the later parts as you will be with the early parts. So yeah, the way this program quote-unquote teaches songs is by having the user play sections of the song in order, and after playing each new section, they have to play the song again from the beginning up to the point of the new section. And if you make a mistake, you again have to replay these parts until you get them right in order to move on to later parts of the song. This is the worst way to teach music. And it doesn't help either that the pacing is not only off with so many of these songs, but that it's not even a factor. All the program is doing is checking for the right notes in the right order and has no consideration for how fast you're actually playing those notes or when you're playing those notes. That little yellow VTech keyboard thing I showed many videos ago, which I got around 1986 when I was 3 years old, that was better at teaching music than this mid-90s program. Overall, Thinkin Things Collection 2 is a definite downgrade from Thinkin Things Collection 1, which was an amazing piece of software. Now, just like with the Kids Do program I reviewed last week, there's nothing offensive in here by any means, and there's definitely some entertainment value, but the educational aspect is handled very poorly, to the point where it pretty much doesn't exist. This is more of a software toy than the first Thinking Things Collection was, and to that end, it's definitely going to keep a child's attention fairly well, just don't expect them to learn that much, if anything. Once again, just like with the first Thinkin Things collection, setting cycles to a fixed count of 30,000 provides the best overall performance for all aspects of the program, but if you set something lower around 20,000, the animations will be timed better in the games, while the blocks sections will perform worse. So it's either a matter of sticking with just one of those cycle settings strictly, or having DOSBox configured to easily switch between those two cycles counts using the Control F11 and Control F12 shortcuts, along with settings to increase and decrease cycles by 10,000 per step. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. My apologies for how Edutainment Month turned out this year, as I had much higher hopes for all of these programs that I covered to actually be better than they turned out to be. So, we're going to kick off May with one of the best full 3D racing games ever released for DOS, despite the fact that a lot of reviewers at the time hated it. Now, this is going to make for an interesting episode, so be sure to send your guests to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned for episode 236 of Ancient DOS Games, coming out on Saturday, May 5th, when we'll explore how such a good game could end up with such poor reviews. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.